The X Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, Relmar McConnell Media Company, the X Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Good evening, one and all, and welcome to another edition of the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell, and for the next 4 hours, I am your host. I am your guide as together we cross the time-space continuum to this place that I call the X Zone. It's a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. It's a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. And the X Zone comes to you Monday through Friday from 10 p.m. Eastern until 2 a.m. Eastern, right here on the X Zone Broadcast Network, Talkstar Radio Network, Mutual Broadcast Network, and Simul Radio TV. If you would like to send me an email, it's very simple. It's the same email address I've had for the past 30 years, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, X Zone Radio TV. And to find out about the programming on the X Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net, and on the X Zone TV channel on Simul TV, simultv.com, and in the search engine, just type in X Zone. My guest this hour is Alan Cassels, and he has been immersed in the pharmaceutical policy research and healthcare journalism for 25 years, mostly researching and writing about how prescription drugs are regulated, marketed, prescribed, and used. Now, the main focus of Alan's writing is the reality of ordinary people who are often facing the sharp end of the pharmaceutical marketing machine, which is increasingly selling us tests, treatments, and theories of disease that turn more and more of us into patients. His books include Selling Sickness, How the World's Biggest Pharmaceutical Companies Are Turning Us All into Patients. It was co-written by Ray Moynihan. How do you say that, Alan?
Moynihan,
okay. The ABCs of Disease Mongering, an Epidemic in 26 Letters, and Seeking Sickness, Medical Screening, and the Misguided Hunt for Disease. Now, Alan believes that humans need clean, clear health information as urgently as they need clean water. His recent book, The Cochrane Collaboration, Medicine's Best Kept Secret, which was published in 2015, weighs into the history of an international organization which produces high-quality medical information. Now, joining me now from Victoria, British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada, is Alan Cassels. And Alan, welcome back to the X Zone.
thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Wow, it's every time you turn on the TV, there's a commercial for medical pharmaceuticals. Not so much here in Canada, but from the States. And everywhere you look on the internet, there's something new about healthcare. There's something new about pharmaceuticals. There's something new about anything that has to do with the regulation of pharmaceuticals and so on. So I would imagine that these are very busy days for you.
Yeah, there's always something new and there's always something interesting. You're right, though, that the average TV watcher is going to get sort of consumed by the amount of advertising for drugs. Certainly, if you're watching American TV. The only country in the world next to New Zealand that allows prescription drugs advertised to consumers, and I think that probably is really one of the major factors why we have such a over-prescribing culture of all that marketing.
Yeah, it's is it my imagination, Alan, or are people getting sicker these days? Well, I remember when I was a kid, you heard about illness very rarely, but in today's society, you talk to somebody, they've got 3 or 4 different diseases, they're taking 12, 14 different prescriptions for them. Like, what's
Yeah,
going on?
it's a good question. A lot of it has to do with our culture, which
Mm-hmm.
really overdiagnoses things. Uh, five years ago, you never really would have heard the term overdiagnosis in medical circles,
Right.
and now there are international conferences just focused on this problem of overdiagnosis. The idea that there are too many people who are being labeled as sick and too much medicine being produced or being marketed to people who are not sick but could be sick, and that's and I think that's a real problem, because a lot of times you end up causing people anxiety and worry when you're marketing diseases in addition to marketing drugs.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's start at the very beginning. Why should this topic be of interest to the average person listening tonight?
Well, because I think most people are, as you say, swimming in this world of thinking that there's so much disease and so much illness around. And it's probably the most important thing in our lives is how healthy we are and how and the health of our families. So clearly this is important for us to make sure we're doing what we can to stay healthy.
Right.
But at the same time, there's an awful lot of money to be made in convincing people that they could be healthier, or they may be sick. And that was the real thrust of the first book that I wrote with Ray Moynihan, Selling Sickness, is that there's simply not enough genuinely sick people out there. So the pharmaceutical industry, among others, has been very aggressively targeting the well, promoting drugs and treatments and screening to people who aren't sick, but who could be convinced that they might have something that they need to worry about and be concerned about.
Well, No, I was just going to ask you. Now, you write and you've even mentioned that screening is over promoted, and oversold. What are some of the good examples that you can share with us?
Well, probably the most common examples that your listeners are going to be aware of is screening for breast cancer, mammography screening, or for men screening for prostate cancer, and that's using a PSA test, a test that measures an antigen in your blood. And you might say, well, what's wrong, Alan, with finding these early signs of cancer so that we can do something about it? And I can tell you, when I started researching this, more than a decade ago, I felt the same way. We should be screening people if it's safe to do so for early signs of disease, because then we can do something about it.
Right.
But the more you dive into the research around prostate cancer screening or breast cancer screening, there are shocking bits of fact everywhere you turn. I mean, I'll give you one example, and that is prostate screening, for example. It's very good at finding this what could be a marker for pre-cancer, and most men where they're told that they have a high prostate reading, high PSA reading, are going to be offered surgery or radiation or other kinds of treatments, without ever being told that your likelihood that prostate cancer is going to kill you is very small. And in fact, men my age, mid-50s, if you were to do a biopsy of everyone's prostate or do a PSA test on everyone, probably half of us have signs of cancer. Well, so you say, well, shouldn't we do something about that? Well, no, because the kinds of cancer that most of us are going to have in our prostates is the slow-growing type that is never going to go on to kill us, that most of us, if we live long enough, are going to die with prostate cancer, but not because of it. And I know that because I've looked at big studies of autopsy studies where men who die of other things, most of them have some signs of prostate cancer. But if you find it, you do something about it. And so you have a huge amount of overdiagnosis, which is men who get unnecessarily treated And that treatment, if it was benign and didn't hurt you, you'd say, well, what's the big deal, Alan?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not benign. A certain percentage of men that have prostate screening are going to end up with a biopsy. Some of them will develop a serious infection that requires them to be hospitalized. Many of them will have their prostates removed. And many of those men will end up becoming incontinent or impotent for the rest of their lives for something that never was going to go on to hurt them.
Fascinating. Listen, Alan, you and I have to take our first break for this hour, so please stand by. And X Zone Nation, our guest this hour is Alan Cassels. And if you'd like to find out more about Alan, here's a website. It's the www.ti.ubc.ca. And that's the home of the Therapeutic Initiative. Once again, www.ti.ubc.ca. And this is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in Niagara, Ontario, Canada. Once again, if you'd like to send me an email, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, X Zone Radio TV. And we'll be back on the other side of this short break, investigating the world of the paranormal and the science of parapsychology and all important matters in between and on either sides, because you, the members of the X Zone Nation, are what matter on this show. I'll be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. And welcome back, everyone. Alan Cassels is our special guest this hour. Once again, his website is www.ti.ubc.ca. You know, Alan, I, for one, am very happy about the new PSA test. It's a lot better than the alternative was. So thank God for medical advances. But to find, would you say that all these tests, many of which you say are not necessary, are just another way to fill the coffers of somebody's pocket?
Yes. I mean, that's the short answer. I mean,
Yeah.
The long answer is that, just to give medicine the benefit of the doubt is that, if you can find signs of disease before it goes on to hurt someone, that could be an overall benefit to humankind, right?
I agree.
So, And there are some screening programs that actually do have some benefit. I mean, probably the one that probably is the best is the Pap smear screening. So they can do examinations of women, a simple exam that can find precancerous signs and action can be taken to prevent, any mortality.
Right.
And so, good thing, we should be doing it. A lot of women are convinced by their doctor it's a good thing, and so it's good that we've got some screening programs that work. At the same time, screening is such big business that there's so much money to be made to not just sell all the treatments that come after the screening, but to sell the screening itself. And one of the most recent examples is lung cancer screening. So as you know, heavy smokers might have a higher risk of developing cancer in their lifetime.
Right.
And if you can do a screening program using, say, CT scanning to find tumors early, then that would be a good thing. There was just a study published, by the way, in the last 2 weeks, which shows how crazy the whole lung cancer screening thing is because even if you screen tens of thousands of former smokers, and these are former heavy smokers, not just people who smoked a little bit when they were younger, but fairly, people who smoked a pack a day for 20 years or 30 years. The benefit of screening over non-screening is so small that there is actually they determined there is no overall mortality benefit. Which is to say, those people that get screened do not live any longer than those who aren't screened.
But isn't it also, like I was saying before, it's a matter of money. If people can, for example, here in Ontario, there are certain tests that if you take because you've got OHIP, it's covered by the government.
Yes.
And, here in Ontario, if you can get more than 5 minutes when you visit a doctor, you're doing good.
Yes. Yeah, that's a shame, isn't it?
It is. And I'll give you a perfect example. I went to my family doctor, and I went there to get my prescriptions refilled like I do every 3 months. I give her my blood pressure chart and so on and so forth. And then I asked her a question. She said, "No, you're not here to ask me that question. Make another appointment." I said,
Yes.
"But I'm here now."
Yeah.
Excuse me, what is it? What's more important today in the medical community? Is it the patient or is it the money?
Well, certainly you see other doctors will say one visit, one complaint. And so, you have to divide your complaints into visits, right?
Exactly.
It's crazy how that works. And
A friend of mine came up with a perfect solution.
Yeah.
He goes into the hospital to the emergency ward and he says, "I'm having problems breathing. My heart is racing fast. I don't feel good. I've got pains in the chest." He gets admitted.
Yeah.
And while he's there, he talks to the doctors who come in and they run every test.
Yeah.
That's it's pretty bad when you've got to submit yourself to doing things underhand because you can't get to see the doctor. Once again, I remember when I was a kid, Dr. St. Ange in Chambly, where I used to live with my parents, $15 for a house call.
Yeah.
And he'd be there, 30, 40 minutes. Okay,
Yeah.
that was back then.
Yeah.
But this brings me back to my original point, Alan. Mm-hmm. How come there's such a difference in the lifestyles today, and so many people are sicker today than they were back there?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know whether people are sicker or whether they believe that they're sicker. So, I'll give you some example that's on my radar.
Okay.
And we study this quite closely. We look at diabetes, right? So the very definitions of diabetes have been highly influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. So it used to be that if you had a hemoglobin A1C, and this is a measurement of blood sugar in your blood, if you had it and it was above 8, that would be a sign that you are having too high a blood sugar and you should be doing something about it.
Right.
And then doctors would recommend people, exercise more, modify their diet, perhaps don't eat as much sugar or starchy kinds of food and so on. Well, then that number over time, and I've seen this, say, in the last 15 years, that number went to 7.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you take the definition and you're not changing what it means to be a diabetic, you're changing the definition from an 8 to a 7, you have suddenly overnight created tens of thousands of more diabetics.
Yep.
Just changing that number. And then, I've got a young friend of mine, a guy who's my age, mid-50s, super fit. He's a cyclist. He started asking me about a particular diabetes drug, and I said to him, because I do drug research, and I said, so why are you asking that? And he said, "Oh, I've been told I got diabetes." I said, "Really? What's your hemoglobin A1C?" And he said, "Well, it's 6.5." And I said, "That's absurd."
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that 8, and then it was 7, and now they're saying that you have an A1C of 6.5 that you're defined as diabetic. And this guy has everything going for him. He's healthy, fit, very active, And I said, you've just suddenly been turned into a patient because of a definition of diabetes. And so when we worry about our doctors not having enough time for us and forcing us to have, 5-minute visits, part of it is that the guidelines that are driving doctors' behavior have been written by the pharmaceutical industry. And so they're measuring people's diabetes, telling them they're diabetic, and then all the drugs and monitoring that happens after that.
Sure.
Yes. So we end up making people's lives busy around possible disease, not real disease.
When did the pharmaceutical industry start taking over the healthcare industry?
It's a good question. It's always been very heavily involved. As you know, the thing is about prescription drugs is that you can't go and buy them off the shelf. You need to have a learned intermediary to prescribe them.
Right.
And so the pharmaceutical industry, of course, knows this very well. And so in order for them to get their drugs sold, they have to convince the prescriber that that's what they need to do. And so this is why you see so much money and effort and energy and, in my opinion, bamboozlement that happens to our doctors, is because the pharmaceutical industry is so heavily involved in I would say, the care and feeding of our physicians. I think the research is pretty definitive that those doctors that have the least contact with the pharmaceutical industry, who don't take the meals, don't go on the trips, don't go to the funded dinners and so on, those doctors are actually better prescribers.
So the doctors who aren't on the take.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just Alan Cassels' opinion. This has been studied.
Oh, no, I agree with you 100%. I agree with you as a layperson and as somebody who has worked within the medical community. I've seen this myself.
Yeah, and it's pretty shocking that we still allow it, that we still allow the drug industry to be fairly centrally involved in the education of physicians. And the group that I work with, we do independent education. We're not funded by the pharmaceutical industry. We get our money from the government. We try to be as objective and really look at drugs with a critical eye, because they're very important drugs, but they shouldn't be overused or misused either. Right?
Well, if there's this much control, how come we're looking at such an opioid crisis in Canada as well as the United States?
That's a very good question. And some would argue, and I think there's some good evidence in Canada where the pharmaceutical industry was very involved in the reshaping of the definitions of pain control, where Purdue Pharmaceuticals, which makes a drug called OxyContin, which really is at the heart of the opioid crisis, they were very involved in doing physician education. They had seminars at the University of Toronto. They helped underwrite the creation of pain guidelines. And so when you've got the drug companies convincing physicians what pain is and how they should treat it, don't be surprised that we now have an epidemic on our hands.
Listen, you and I have to take our break for the news at the bottom of the hour. Please stand by, Alan. And for more information, X Zone Nation, visit www.ti.ubc.ca. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell, Alan Cassels, and I return on the other side of this break. Don't go away. Alan Cassels is our special guest this hour, and his website is www.ti.ubc.ca. And he is the author of Seeking Sickness, Selling Sickness, and the Cochrane Collaboration, Medicine's Best Kept Secret, which are available at Amazon and many brick-and-mortar bookstores and libraries. Also, just before we get back to the interview, tell me about TEDx Talk.
Yeah, I did. I've done two of them. The last one was basically about what I called kind of medicine's unspoken heroes. The fact that we have a number of I guess you might want to call them brave whistleblowers in the medical world who've been very important in sort of highlighting some of the problems with medical research and really sort of bringing attention to how we can improve things. I mean, I think the one of the best examples that I used in that TEDx talk was this guy named Ignaz Semmelweis. He was an obstetrician in the 1840s and 50s in Austria, and noticed that women who were they had two hospitals, one where the women were treated by midwives and one they were treated by physicians. And the death rate amongst the mothers and babies in the hospital that was run by the doctors was twice or three times as high as it was with the ones with the midwives. And Semmelweis determined that the physicians in the hospitals were doing autopsies and then delivering babies, and there was something on their hands. And he basically said, let's bring in an experiment and get the doctors to wash their hands. And when that happened, the death rate dropped through the floor. And clearly, he didn't know what the germ theory, this was way before Pasteur, basically saying that physicians need to wash their hands in order to save their patients. And I use that kind of as a metaphor for the influence of the pharmaceutical industry, where I believe that you get better medical care if physicians were washing their hands of the influence of the drug companies.
Now, how can listeners listen to your TEDx talks?
They're both on YouTube. You could just Google my name and TEDx. You'll find them quite easily.
All right. Mental health is a big issue.
For sure.
How come more attention isn't being paid to mental health compared to the rest of the pharmaceutical availables?
That's a good question, but I would argue that there's an awful lot of attention paid to mental health, though we don't really have great systems in place to deal with people that are dealing with mental health, other than mostly drugs. I mean, psychiatry is mostly about tweaking people's brain or serotonin levels with drugs.
Yes.
Which a lot of people find ultimately quite unsatisfying, not effective, and the drugs that they use can often come with a whole range of side effects, including increasing risks of suicide, of all things. And I think and we've done some work in the past about the major antidepressants that are used for people who prescribe drugs for depression and so on. And the problems with these drugs are becoming legion. I mean, we're starting to understand how difficult it is for people to stop taking antidepressants, the serious problems that people undergo when they try to stop, and just the real lack of alternatives. I mean, I think when you look at the research around mental health, that cognitive behavioral therapy, this would be like talk therapy and so on, is way more effective than pharmaceuticals, though it's not paid for as much. So someone who has difficulty in a difficult life patch, instead of getting the kind of counseling and cognitive behavioral therapy they need, there's a good chance a doctor will prescribe a drug. And that is often the beginning of a long problem for many people.
Right.
Where it's not a solution, it's not even a Band-Aid. It's just another problem added to the list of problems that you already have.
Does the pharmaceutical companies make more money when it comes to mental health issues compared to physiological issues, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, no, I think I don't actually know, though mental health or physical health. I think probably the vast majority of the drugs that we get prescribed
Hmm.
would be for physical symptoms. Things like blood pressure
Yeah.
and cholesterol and blood sugar. Diabetes drugs, drugs for cancer, and so on. Probably that would be the vast bulk of drugs. At the same time, we increasingly see the marketing and prescribing of drugs for schizophrenia. These would be antipsychotic drugs that are increasingly used for people who don't have psychosis, who aren't bipolar, who don't have schizophrenia, and they get prescribed these super powerful drugs that have whole ranges of problems. We've, in every province in Canada, um, a large majority of the seniors in long-term care facilities are going to be prescribed drugs called atypical antipsychotics. These would be drugs like Seroquel or risperidone and so on. Super powerful drugs, very important for people that have schizophrenia, but they're being often used for in long-term care facilities for old people to calm them down and turn them into zombies. It's really an appalling state of affairs when we're using drugs as sort of chemical straitjackets on older people.
Well, aren't we doing the same thing with younger people by putting them on Ritalin?
Yeah, Ritalин's a different story. By the way, I should tell you something. And this is very interesting research that we did here in British Columbia. We looked at children who are prescribed drugs for ADHD, for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and we looked at what we call the birth month. So we looked at children who are say born between January and June versus those kids born between July and December. And guess what we found? The kids who were born in the latter part of the year, so these would be the younger kids in the
Yeah.
class, had 50 to 70% higher rates of attention deficit disorder drugs compared to the older children in the class. You might say, well, what the heck's going on there?
Yeah.
Well, younger kids who perhaps aren't as mature and able to sit down and sit still and shut up are increasingly being medicated for having behavioral problems. This is something that this research we did here in British Columbia was replicated in 4 or 5 other countries, found the same thing. The younger kids are being medicalized for behavioral problems and are being prescribed these very strong amphetamines or stimulants that are affecting their brains. We think that if there's a genuine medical problem, that the drugs might help. But when it's clear that there's evidence that this is not a medical problem for a lot of these kids. This is a social issue,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
This is the fact that the teacher's got 30 kids in the class and 2 or 3 boys that are being little buggers and won't sit still. And the teacher tells the parents that unless you take Johnny to the doctor to get him sort of chemically altered, so maybe the teacher just really needs a little bit of help in the classroom.
But what about the government stepping in and taking control and say, hey, you just can't do that?
Yeah, it's very interesting when you say the government, because most of the medical practice would say, well, we don't listen to the government. We don't let the government tell us what to do.
But they're licensed by the government. The government has the right to
true.
do that.
It's true. They do to some extent. I mean, certainly the opioid crisis has shown us that the government, or certainly the regulatory bodies, the colleges of physicians, are very much willing to step in and sort of say, look, you have to improve your practice in this area. But the government, in terms of them directly influencing prescribing, that simply doesn't happen.
Well, after all, the government does make tax money off the big pharma, and if they were to kind of slap big pharma on the wrist through the doctors, they'd make less money. Oh, I get
But
it. Okay.
yeah, but at the same time, the governments are huge buyers of drugs too,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
They're
Yeah.
and so, um, I don't want to brag about my province of British Columbia, but we do have some things right, and one of the things that we have right is that we have a bit of a firewall between the drug companies and the government in terms of reducing the amount of influence of the companies.
Alan, I hate to do this, my friend, but you and I have to take our final break. This is a very interesting conversation, and I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and discussing this with us.
Excellent, quite enjoy it.
All right, stand by, my friend. Here we go. And Alan and I will be back as we wrap up this hour here in the X Zone from our broadcast center and studios in Niagara, Ontario, Canada. I'm Rob McConnell. Send me your emails. Send me your comments. If you've got a special guest you'd like to have on the show, or if there's something that I said that you disagree with, X-Zone at xzoneradiotv.com. We'll be back after this break. Don't go away. Exonation. Alan Cassels is our special guest. We're talking about Big Pharma, amongst other things. And Alan, how did you get involved in doing the work that you're doing?
I started a research project when I was in university still, doing a master's degree, and the study there was around changing the way the provincial government was going to cover certain classes of drugs. Basically, if you had drugs that are equally effective, it would make sense to try to pick the least expensive and provide coverage for those. This is a hugely controversial policy in the mid 90s in British Columbia, and that was the beginning of what was going to be a small research project. It became a career for me. I just found the thing that fascinates me the most is that between what the companies and the experts say about drugs and what the actual research and what the evidence says about the drug, there's often a huge gap. And this gap is that people really are bamboozled and fooled by what they hear from advertising and so on. I mean, that the example that really shocked me, and I can remember this, is that there was an advertisement for this drug for osteoporosis that was proclaiming to reduce the rate of hip fractures by 50%. And I'm like, what? That is amazing. If hip fractures are a huge public health problem.
Sure are.
And when I looked at the study, say, well, how many of these women who had osteoporosis, they were high risk, how many of them had a hip fracture in the whatever 4 years that the trial was on? Well, about 2 out of 100, about 2%. Those are the women taking the placebo. But if you took the drug, it would reduce that from 2 down to 1. So only 1 in 100 women had a hip fracture. But really, the drug helps 50% of people. How is that? Well, if you go from 2 down to 1, that's a 50% drop. And so the advertising, the marketing, the information to doctors was all about this 50% reduction, when in fact it was a 1 in 100 reduction. And that kind of statistical bamboozlement I started to see everywhere, and was really quite shocked at how even today, 20, 25 years later, you still see advertisements that use this misleading relative risk reductions. And that has kind of turned me into an activist in a sense, and someone who wants to say, look, people need to be able to have a good, clear understanding about how much a drug is going to help them before they take the drug. They need to know that does the drug help 1 in 100 people? or 50 in 100 people. That's really important information. And you know, the deeper that you dive into the research on pharmaceuticals, the more you realize that many of the drugs are very important, but still have very small effects, much smaller than most people would realize.
So how can we rectify the bamboozling effect that big pharma has taken over the population with the help of social media, online advertising, radio and television advertising? Where do we go?
Well, I think people have to demand independent information. I mean, that I think is the solution to everything, in the sense of you want your physician to be getting information that's paid for by government or perhaps by their own professional society, not from a pharmaceutical company. And until we put a proper firewall up against, between the drug companies and the doctors, they're going to continue to consume biased information, and that is going to influence people's health. And I think as a patient, you got to be able to ask hard questions. Like if you're about to start on a drug regime, say something that is going to influence, say, your cholesterol, you need to know, how will the drug help? How many people out of 100, like me, would take a drug for, say, 5 years, and what it will be their level of benefit? And a good doctor is going to be able to tell you that information. If you've never had a heart attack or stroke, and you're in your mid 60s or 70s and you're taking a cholesterol lowering drug, the benefits are probably less than 1%, maybe 1 to 2%. So 98 to 99% of the people that are taking that drug are not going to have any benefit. They're going to spend money. They're going to experience side effects related to the drug, and they'll probably not see any benefit. So people need to ask hard questions before they start on a lifetime of new drugs.
What about the sharp increase in the cost of drugs? How does big pharma, justify that?
Well, certainly in the U.S. they justify it because they claim that those drugs are expensive because they spend a lot of money on research and development. Which is not quite true, because most of what the pharmaceutical industry spends on is marketing, communications and marketing, selling their drugs, or doing things to extend their patents, not anything to increase the value of the drug. The thing is that a lot of the most useful treatments that we've got today are generic. They've been around for a long time. They're cheap. Lots of other companies can make them. And I would say the vast majority of conditions that people have can be treated with generic drugs. Not everything. I mean, there are some newer treatments that might have some level of benefit and are still under patent. Therefore, they're quite expensive. But no, the vast majority of conditions that people have, you don't need a brand name drug. You can be probably, for the most part, treated with a generic drug.
But once again, it depends on the marketing and the advertising that the drug company puts into it, and how they get the doctor, or I should say the patient, to say, well, no, I've heard about this drug and this is the one I want.
Yes. Yeah, well, people get easily confused about what's valuable and what isn't. But I'll tell you, in Ontario, there are probably 5,000 to 6,000 drugs on the market, prescription drugs on the market. Mm-hmm. How many of those are on the World Health Organization's essential drugs list?
I could not tell you, my friend.
It's about 340.
So what about the other ones?
Well, the other ones are not would not be considered by the World Health Organization to be essential. They are Me Too drugs. They might be different formulations and so on. But yes, the number of actual essential pharmaceuticals is shockingly small.
Can you give our listeners an example of the essential drugs compared to the ones that are not essential?
Okay. Yeah. For example, a drug like, say you've got trouble with your blood sugar, and the first drug that a physician should consider, if you need one at all, would be a drug called metformin.
Yeah, I take it myself.
Okay, yeah, it's a generic drug. It's been
Yeah.
around a long time. It's got some reasonable evidence of effectiveness, though I can tell you there are probably 30 or 40 drugs for diabetes on the market, way more expensive than metformin. I'm not saying twice as expensive. We're talking 10 to 100 times more expensive, but have worse evidence and have higher rates of mortality associated with
Holy
them.
cow.
But those drugs are actually the ones that you see advertised on TV as well, where they advertise drugs as being new. Maybe they're better at lowering your blood sugar, but what's really important is whether does it prevent heart attacks or strokes. And we have that kind of evidence with metformin, some evidence anyways, but not with a lot of the newer diabetes drugs. And that's what you see advertised on TV. And people, they think, well, if they're advertised, they must be really good. No, not at all. Those newer drugs, by the way, would not be on the World Health Organization's essential drugs list.
So is it your opinion that there should be more control over the advertising of pharmaceutical products through the mass media?
Absolutely. But partly because people need good quality information.
Right.
And they need it from an independent source. And, finding good quality information, and I know this because this is what I do for a living, is very difficult for people to do. I know where to look because I've been doing this for a long time, but finding good quality drug information is kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. And the marketing just makes the haystack bigger. So you want to avoid any commercial sources of drug information. If you've got diabetes, you go to the Diabetes Association, you're probably going to get, certainly when it comes to the information about the drugs, you're going to get biased information because that organization takes money from the pharmaceutical industry. They can't give independent information about drugs because they're paid by the manufacturers of these newer diabetes drugs. The metformin manufacturers are not rich, and they're not trying to get their information to doctors.
Alan, I hate to do this, my friend, but you and I have run out of time for tonight. We'll have you back on in the future because we still have so much to talk about. Thank you so much for the work you do. I sincerely appreciate it. And keep the great work up, and it's always nice talking to a fellow Canadian.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's been my great pleasure. And Exonation, if you'd like more information, visit www.ti.ubc.ca. I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center and studios in Niagara, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away.